The English state of the 10th and 11th centuries was one of the most advanced, centralised and administratively efficient realms of the early medieval era. It boasted a powerful monarch, well-run local government in the shire system, and claimed overlordship over the entire British Isles. It was capable of raising both vast financial and human resources at short notice and exerting its will both at home and abroad. Yet despite these advantages, the kingdom would be forced to endure the depredations of Viking raiders in the latter parts of the 10th century, before suffering 2 conquests from Scandinavian kings in the early 11th century. Whilst the House of Wessex was able to reassert itself under the reign of Edward the Confessor, this would only last until his death in 1066, where the throne would forever pass out of the rule of its native house. The question then presented is why such a highly developed kingdom was unable to cope with the challenges it faced in the 10th and 11th century. Why was the House of Wessex able to drive out and subdue the Norsemen under Alfred, yet failed so spectacularly under its latter kings? Why would it then fall to the Normans some 50 years later, and why would it fail to excise itself from their yoke? A good place to begin would be the reign of Æthelred, famously known by his epithet, the Unready, or in Old English, Undlied, the ill-counselled. The much-maligned king would reign for 37 years, one of the longest reigns in English history. Yet would see his armies defeated in battle, cities sacked, whole counties burned, and would even be deposed. Whilst he would die as king, he would leave his heir in an impossible position. In order to understand the reign of Æthelred, we need to establish a backdrop to his ascension, especially in regards to the reign of Edgar the Peaceful, his father, and Edward the Martyr, his half-brother. The late 9th and early 10th century had been a period of expansion for the embryonic Kingdom of England. Following a successful defence of Wessex, Alfred the Great was able to almost double the size of his kingdom with the domination of the Rump of Mercia, a portion of which had survived the Vikings. Edward the Elder would continue this trend of expansion with the aid of his sister Æthelflaed, Lady of the Mercians. Edward's reign saw the conquest of all England below the Humber. His son, Athelstan, widely considered to be the first king of England, was able to finish the job in 927, with his conquest of York. He was then able to successfully preserve the unity of his new-won realm with his great victory of Brunanburh in 937. There was a setback under the reign of Edmund, where Anlaf Gurfrithson was able to briefly regain the Danelaw up to the 5 boroughs in the 940s. Later on, Eric Bloodaxe was able to successfully restore Northumbrian independence in the 950s. These setbacks, however, were quickly reversed, and overall, the English state was able to expand to include all of the territories of the formerly independent kingdoms. Following the untimely death of Edward, an all too common occurrence with regards to the House of Wessex, we come to the reigns of Eadwig and Edgar, the uncle and father of Æthelred respectively. The reign of Eadwig Allfair is where we need to take a more in-depth look at the internal affairs of the kingdom. Aside from his wedding day antics, Edwig's reign was important for the appointment of Alfheir to the earldom of Mercia in 955. It appears that this was done to limit the power of one Athelstan Half-King, the ealdorman of East Anglia. Athelstan Half-King was one of the most powerful ealdormen of the early English kingdom, having been appointed to the role during the reign of Athelstan, and during the reign of Edward he was further able to expand his influence. Many of the lands granted to Alfheir were taken from the earldom of East Anglia, though it is important to note that these lands had been traditionally associated with Mercia, having been under East Anglian rule for only 50 years. Athelstan himself was then retired to the monastery at Glastonbury in 956, and it has been implied that this was not done on a voluntary basis. Eadwig did attempt to maintain balance within the system, by allowing for the appointment of Brynolf, a member of Athelstan's patrimony, to the earldom of Essex. His treatment of Athelstan, however, had caused a split within the English kingdom. The supporters of Athelstan withdrew their allegiance from Eadwig, and instead supported Edgar, the king's younger brother. Edgar took with him Mercia and Northumbria. Alfheir, despite being in Edwig's camp, was remarkably able to survive this threat to his power by jumping on the Edgar bandwagon once it became apparent that all of Mercia was on board with Edgar. This, however, did little to solve the issues between the two power blocks. It was Edwig's untimely death in 959 that allowed for the kingdom to be reunified, as Edgar was able to claim Wessex with no resistance. The rulership of Edgar can be said to represent the apogee of the Anglo-Saxon state. He ruled a kingdom analogous in size to that of the modern-day country, save Cumberland and the addition of parts of Lothian. There were no Viking raids or attacks during his reign, and he was able to claim overlordship over the entire island. This is best illustrated by the most famous event of his reign, his imperial coronation at Bath, then subsequently being rowed down the River Dee outside Chester by the kings of Scotland, Strathclyde and 5 Welsh princes. Whilst it is disputed as to whether this event took place, or was invented later by Norman scholars to justify imperialism, it can be used to illustrate the power of Edgar within the island of Great Britain at the time. His reign, however, is best known for his patronage of monastic reform. This may seem like a rather dry and innocuous subject, however, this was an age of faith, and it would have dramatic consequences for his successors. The movement had emerged on the continent in the early 10th century as a response to the over-secularisation of monastic life. Abbots could buy their positions, monks were able to own their own land and property in private, and many monks were not celibate, and had familial links with the surrounding communities. It is important to note that many of these criticisms came from reformist monks, though given the number of attempts at reform during the 9th and 10th century, there must have been some basis to their claims. English monasticism had also been devastated by the Viking conquests of the 9th century, with many great houses such as Yarrow, Abingdon and Hexham being greatly reduced in status and prestige. The reform movement had first come to England under Edmund, when Dunstan, one of the great reformers of Edgar's reign, was appointed as the abbot of Glastonbury. Edmund, however, was half-hearted at best in his support for the movement, and nominated a non-reformist abbot to Bath during this same period. Given the rapid turnover of English monarchs following Edmund's death, there was little progress. Edward seemed willing to financially support the reformers, though he was not willing to put political clout behind the movement. Eadwig, by comparison, appears to have been actively hostile, having Dunstan exiled to the continent. It is important to know that Æthelred, another important reformer, remained loyal to the king, again suggesting a half-hearted opposition. It is not known until Edgar that a reform movement would find its secular champion. There were several reasons as to why Edgar threw his wholesale support behind the movement. Firstly, Edgar was genuinely religious, and the fate of one's eternal soul was of great importance. To complement this, the religious health of a kingdom's subjects was the responsibility of the king, and the piety of the king was often seen to directly correspond to the success of the kingdom. What better way was there then to secure not only your own soul, but the soul of the kingdom itself, than by carrying out a radical purification of the monasteries? Throughout history, monarchs have tried to erode the power of their local nobility. The Reformation movement served as a perfect opportunity to weaken the power of these magnates by empowering monasteries, whilst these same monasteries would be both dependent upon and beholden to the king. It would also help cement the unity of the kingdom, which, as we have seen, was all too easy to split. The monasteries would act as islands of monarchical power, from which his will would flow. They would also be uniform, following the same rules and imparting a common culture in a key pillar of the kingdom. This uniformity would also then allow for other features of the West Saxon state to be exported to the periphery, such as the shire system and burhs, which began appearing in English Mercia around this time. Edgar began almost immediately implementing reformist policies following his ascension to the throne. Beorhthelm, the incumbent Archbishop of Canterbury, was expelled and replaced with Dunstan in 959. This was ironically enough in violation of canon law, and would have been stopped as it was in the case of Gerbert of Reims in 991, had the church had more power. Æthelwold was given the bishopric of Winchester, and Oswald was granted Worcester. The houses of Winchester were then forcibly reformed, with those refusing to live under the rules of St. Benedict expelled and deprived of property. This model was then applied to other unreformed houses with the support of the king and the support of the most powerful bishops in the realm. These reformations often came with land grants. The most notable example of this comes from Worcester, where following its reformation, its bishop was granted both liberties and lands surrounding the seat, creating what has become known as a shipsoak. Not only did this take away from the lands and patronage of the original owner, in this case Alfheir and his patronage, but they were also granted control of the local thryde, and local rights of inheritance were curtailed, as they held their lands now not through patronage, but as tenants of the church. In the case of Worcester, This liberty, known as Oswald's Slough, surrounded the Burgh of Worcester, effectively surrounding one of Alfhere's centres of power with soldiers not under his command, greatly weakening his local power base. It is important to note that there is a lot of controversy with regards to this aspect of the reform movement with reference to documentation, namely that the charters granting liberties to Worcester have been asserted to be forgeries created in the post-conquest era. Though there are said to be authentic historical aspects to the claims made in the forgeries, thus why I use them as examples. Nothing, though, is without downsides, and for every issue that the backing of the reform movement solved, a new one was created. The empowerment of the monasteries naturally created winners and losers. Firstly, the expulsion of lay canons and deprivation of local landholders created a broiling sea of resentment towards the bishops, abbots, and crown. Not only had their power been weakened on a personal basis, but they also see members of their patronage reduced as well. It is also important to note that the church was not a monolith institution. There were many within the organisation who opposed the reform movement or fell victim to reformers. The empowerment of the church and monastic institutions also increased their influence and the value of their opinions, and one area in which church influence had been growing was with regards to matrimony. Thus this would be the perfect time to divert into Edgar's numerous marriages. Unfortunately, as with most queens of this time period, there is a dearth of information with regards to Edgar's first two spouses. His first wife was Æthelred, who was believed to have been a daughter of an associate of Athelstan Half-King. It was with her that Edgar sired his first son, Edward. She disappears from the historical record, and it seems she was either set aside or died in the early 960s. His second wife or consort was Wulfrith, with whom Edgar had a single daughter, Edith. Historians are currently unsure as to whether this was an actual marriage or if she was instead a consort of some sorts. Regardless, she was later set aside, and Edgar was married again in the mid-960s to Æthelfrith, a daughter of Eadwig, who was an ealdorman in the southwest of England. Ælfrith can accurately be described as the first queen to make the role her own, and would have considerable impact in the coming decades. Though what is important now is that she bore two children with Edgar, Edmund, who was to die young, and Æthelred. Examining charters from the time, it is clear that there was an issue with the legitimacy of Edward. The charter for the refounding of the new minster lists his son, in this case Edmund, with Ælfrith as an atheling, whilst Edward is only listed as begotten by the same king. It is also noted that the queen is referred to as a legitimate wife, which seems to be a very pointed inclusion. Charter witnesses serve as crucial snapshots for the state of play within a kingdom at a given time. Being higher on a charter meant that you were more in favour with the king, or perhaps had more political influence. It may be that with the church enforcing consanguinity laws more strongly, it would have been seen as an impossibility for Edward to succeed, given that in fact he was a bastard. It has also been suggested that England was following the Byzantine practice of children of reigning monarchs having greater rights than those born before, i.e. being born in the purple. Though personally I do not believe this to be the case. A final problem, though in fairness perhaps not one that Edgar could have foreseen, was the change to the cultural environment that the movement would have. The strive for reformation led to a desire to purity, which spread out from the monasteries into lay society. This had already begun to show even early on in the process. A plague in 962 was blamed by Edgar and Dunstan on divine displeasure, and that in response, tithes were to be paid with all gladness and willingness, as opposed to the more natural begrudging manner. Meanwhile, Winchester was divided into zones in order to ensure the seclusion of monks and nuns by Æthelwold. This was achieved by the diversion of rivers and planting of hedges, leading to the destruction of numerous buildings and forced relocation of citizens. This was something that was of little concern during good times, though during bad times it could, as it has done many times in history, spiral into recriminations, infighting and accusation. As a final aside, Edgar's reign also saw continued administrative reform. Coinage was standardised and new law codes were issued. As mentioned earlier, there was little military action, aside from raiding against the Welsh in Strathclyde and Wales proper. There is only one mention of the king using force within England, namely in 969, when he ordered Thanet to be plundered for an unknown reason. His reign also saw the further consolidation of the earldoms of England into smaller and smaller units, until a roughly fourfold division had been effected. These earldoms appear very similar to those of the pre-Viking invasion, namely Mercia under Alfheir, Northumbria under Oslach, and East Anglia under Athelwine, with Wessex being ruled by the king proper. There was also Brynorth in Essex, though he was very closely aligned with Athelwine, both being members of the patrimony of Athelstan Half-King. It is important to note that these earldoms were in no way independent nor intended to be hereditary, though there were exceptions, with the notable example being that the family of Athelstan Half-King seemed to have a very strong grip on East Anglia. Whilst the old kingdoms of the Heptarchy had been destroyed, their memory and the tribal divisions still remained strong. It was in fact an appeal to mercy and patriotism, if such a term can be used, that aided Edgar in gaining the throne in the first place. Again, these forces were held at bay under Edgar. He acquired his epithet the Peaceful, better translated as a peacemaker, for a reason. He was able to successfully hold the nation together through his own willpower and magnetism, and were he to die, the opposing forces could pull the kingdom apart. Luckily for England, Edgar was only 31 in 975, thus had a long future ahead of him. The death of Edgar was a sudden and unexpected event. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, known for recounting the most extraordinary of events in the driest tone possible, practically broke out in hysterics following his passing. The 8th before the Ides of July, here Edgar died, ruler of Angles, West Saxons' joy, and Mercians' protector. Known was it widely throughout many nations, that, offspring of Edmund, or the Garnet's Bath, honoured far. Kings in widely bowed to the king, as was his due by kind. No fleet was so daring, no army so strong, that mid the English nation took from him aught, the while that noble king ruled on his throne. Succession was a difficult time for any kingdom, especially during the early medieval era. The rules of succession had not yet been fully established. Edgar was also a very authoritative king. He ruled the whole of Wessex personally, and his death threw the realm into chaos. Almost immediately, attacks began on monasteries. The Life of St. Oswald, hagiography written by Bryfirth of Ramsey, describes the scene as thus. The great king died on the 8th of July. At his death, the commonwealth of the entire realm was shaken. Bishops were perplexed, ealdormen were angry, monks were struck with fear, the people were terrified, and the secular clerics were made happy, because their time had come. Abbots are now expelled, together with their monks. Clerics are brought in together with their wives, and the last error was worse than the first. This was not hyperbole. We have detailed accounts of attacks on monastic property at Peterborough and Kettering by Leofsiege, a local thane, that caused so much damage that crops could not be sown for 2 years. Alfheir of Mercia was said to have encouraged attacks upon reformed houses within the West Midlands, such as Winchcombe, Evesham, Pershaw and Deerhurst. These are all notable for having been founded by St. Oswald. Meanwhile, in East Anglia, Athelwine was said to have raised an army to defend the houses of his earldom should the disorder spread. This has been portrayed as an anti-monastic reaction against the policies of Edgar, in no part due to Bryfirth's account, but modern-day historians seem now to see it as being motivated by desire to see lands taken, often far below market value, returned, than being motivated by any ideological bent. A good example of this were the actions of Alfheir. As mentioned earlier, he did see that many monastic houses were despoiled. He was also, though, a great supporter of the reformed house of Glastonbury. It is Sir Alfheir's great misfortune that the only surviving accounts of this period come to us from Ramsey, which was considered to be part of his lost patrimony. Thus this was a political dispute, not an ideological one. Regardless, there can be no doubt to the seriousness of the disturbances. Why then was there such a crisis following the death of Edgar? As noted beforehand, there were issues with the legitimacy of Edward, namely the status of the marriage of his parents. There was also the issue of his behaviour. Bryfirth, a supporter of Edward, noted that he had an exceptionally violent streak to his character, and was known for striking courtiers. Edgar of Canterbury also makes note of this, claiming that many supported Æthelred due to his gentler character. It is important to note that this was written in the late 11th century though, far removed from the actual events. With these doubts to his legitimacy and the option of an alternate candidate, those who had not found favour in the reign of Edward naturally gravitated towards the alternate candidate. On one hand we have Edward's party, which was centred upon the Alderman Brynolf of Essex and Athelwine of East Anglia, who wished to restore their preeminence within the kingdom, with the support of Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Oswald, the Archbishop of York. Meanwhile, Alfhere, naturally in opposition to Athelwine, was drawn to support Æthelred. It is here that we can also see the influence of kinship groups. Æthelred's mother was close with Athelwold, who had broken with his fellow bishops and thus lent his support to Æthelred. As the historian Roach notes, it seems that the disputes, which had begun under the reign of Eadwig, had continued to fester under the reign of Edgar, with the Old Guard, who had power and influence under Edmund and Edred, supporting Edward's claim to the throne, whilst those who had risen to power under Eadwig, namely Alfhere, supported Æthelred. It is evidence of the seriousness of the dispute that split the kingdom that it took almost 8 months for Edward to be crowned king, and during this time the breakdown of society continued unabated. Was there a solution? The crisis appears very similar to that which befell England during the reign of Eadwig. Splitting the kingdom between Edward and Æthelred did seem to be a reasonable solution. However, the support of Archbishop Oswald for Edward made this an impossibility, seeing as he was also the Archbishop of Worcester, which lay within the heart of Alfhere's territory, and said Alfhere was a supporter of Æthelred. It could also be argued, as it is by Ryan Lavelle, that in fact the success of Edgar's policies had made it simply impossible to contemplate a division of the kingdom, that the culture of uniformity spread through the Benedictine movement had made it an impossibility to contemplate any other action. Thus, there were no easy fixes. Why then was Edward able to secure the throne, despite the aforementioned legitimacy issues, and that it was clear the intention of Edgar for Æthelred to succeed? The main selling point seems to have been age. At the time of Edgar's death, Edward appears to have been around 16, not ideal, but much better than Æthelred, who is believed to have been between the ages of 6 and 9. Regencies were often disastrous, thus needed to be avoided at all costs. It seems to have been Dunstan who led the charge in getting Edward crowned, and his support, together with that of the Archbishop of York, appeared to have been the deciding factor. It may be that a similar solution was put in place to that which was implemented when Athelstan came to the throne, whereby he would not marry, and that the throne would pass to his half-brother. Æthelred was granted lands which were traditionally associated with the king's son, indicating that he was seen as the designated heir. Edward was now king, but in a precarious position. The anarchy of the interregnum had seen the mass seizure of territory from his natural supporters. His need for support led to the appointment of several new ealdormen within Wessex: Athelwold in western Wessex, Athelmar in central Wessex, and Edwin in Surrey. Whilst this would seem to be a sensible plan, it did further alienate Alfhere, as it put paid to his designs on reclaiming his brother's former earldom. This further alienation of Alfhere was then coupled with the expulsion of Oslac from Northumbria. We are not given a clear reason as to why, though it has been suggested that it may have been due to his support of the aggressive reforming practices of Oswald, which had alienated many of the local Northumbrian nobility. The expulsion of a local magnate in of itself is not a realm-threatening event. However, for Edward, it was very serious. Given Oslac had familial ties to Athelwine and lightly supported his faction, his expulsion allowed an effect for an alliance between the notables of Mercia and Wessex in opposition to the king. It has also been suggested, however, that Oslac was expelled due to his support for Æthelred, which further complicates the situation on the ground. Unfortunately, we will most likely never know. Edward seemed also to have had little luck. In 976, the Chronicle notes that there was a great famine in England, which was most likely exacerbated by the burning of crops the previous year. Worse, in early 978, there was a disaster at Calne in Wessex, where a meeting of the king's councillors was taking place on the first floor of a building. Whilst we know from charters that all political parties were present when needed, it is more than likely that Edward would have been surrounding himself by those he trusted. The event is summarised by the chronicles as thus. This year all the oldest councillors of England fell at Calne from an upper floor, but the holy Archbishop Dunstan stood alone upon a beam. Some were dreadfully bruised, and some did not escape with life. This would have been a disaster for the young king, and I do not think that it is a coincidence that it is shortly after this event that Edward would meet his end. With the eroding of Edward's grasp on the throne, it was now obvious that Æthelred's faction could act and secure their position. This would happen on the 18th of March at the village of Corfe. Following a hunting trip, Edward made a visit to his half-brother at the Gap of Corfe in Dorset. Upon arrival at his brother's estate, Edward was met by his stepmother, Æthelred, and an armed retinue. According to Stowell, a forensic pathologist who examined the remains of the king in the 1930s, Edward was first stabbed from the side, the force of which broke both his arms. He was then pushed back in his saddle, fracturing his hip and forcing him from his horse, and as his horse bolted, he was further dragged for several feet before coming free. Naturally, this led to his death. The indignity did not end there. His body was then kept in the house of a local thane for over a year, before his body was eventually buried in Shaftesbury Abbey by Alfheir. We now arrive at one of the great murder mysteries in medieval history. The most obvious beneficiary was Æthelred, who, as the only claimant left to the throne, was acclaimed king soon afterwards. Though given his age and his relation to the victim, it is unlikely that he was any part of the plot. Æthelwold, though having supported the claim of Æthelred, is also an unlikely candidate, given that he was a bishop. This then leaves two main potential culprits, Alfheir of Mercia and Æthelfrith, the Queen Mother. Our main primary source for this is once again Bryforth of Ramsey, who does not lay the blame on anyone, though Æthelred and the Queen are noted to have been present. Post-conquest sources, such as Henry of Huntingdon and John of Worcester, are almost universal in their blame of the Queen Mother. Whilst it is true that medieval sources were normally very biased against women, especially those with power, this cannot be used to wholly discredit them, especially when Æthelfrith had so much to gain with her son on the throne. It is also telling that a saintly cult of two Kentish princes, who were also killed by their stepmother, experienced a sharp revival in 978 in East Anglia, a pointed political jab from the Æthelwine faction at court. Alfheir also had a lot to gain. Having lost the contest to the throne in 975, he had no way to maintain his position at court and fight for his interests with Edward as king. It is also telling that in the coming regency, Alfheir was to be the backbone of the nobility that supported Æthelred. Alfheir also arranged for Edward to be buried, and this can be read in two ways. Firstly, to distance himself from Æthelfrith, or to assuage his guilty conscience. I am personally of the opinion that Æthelfrith and Alfheir were both responsible for the death of Edward. They had the most to gain from him dying, and they had the means to arrange for such an event to occur. Edward's death was a shocking event. The king was God's anointed representative on earth, and whilst he was not the first victim of regicide in English history, Edmund, for example, having been killed in a brawl with a criminal, there was no political motivation behind the deed. It was an unfortunate accident. The death of Edward was deliberate and planned. Contemporary sources account the following. There has not been mid-Angles a worse deed done than this was. Since they first Britain land sought, men him murdered, but God him glorified. He was in life an earthly king. He is now after death a heavenly saint. Him would not his earthly kinsman avenge, but him hath his heavenly Father greatly avenged. It also created a massive cultural headache for Æthelred. Aside from the accusations of usurpation, honour was a crucial facet of English life at the time. It was expected for any member of society to seek vengeance and justice for his kin. The issue for Æthelred is that the perpetrators were his kin and support base. It would not be possible for him to punish his mother or Alfheir without critically weakening his own power. There is also the aside that he was 12 at best when he became king. It would be very hard for him to avenge his brother at such an age. Regardless, when the Vikings resumed their raids against England, it would be claimed by many that Æthelred's failure to act is what caused God's wrath to descend upon the English, and in many ways, they were not wrong. Before beginning to look at the reign of Æthelred, we also need to take into account developments within Scandinavia and northern Germany. To the regret of many, England does not exist in a political vacuum, and there was a reason that Vikings resumed raiding in the 980s despite decades of peace beforehand. We do not know much about the unification of Denmark under Harald Bluetooth. Other than the Icelandic sagas recorded in the 13th century and a series of contemporary runestones, there is little information available. What we do know is that Harald was able to extend his power from his kingdom in Jelling to eventually encompass the entirety of Jutland, Zeeland, and even parts of modern-day Norway, namely Viken. We know that he had vast human and financial resources at his disposal due to his construction of several great fortresses, the most famous of which being that at Trelleborg, with estimates being given that they were able to hold around 500 soldiers each. He was also responsible for the Christianization of Denmark, though his success in this regard was less than desired. He was baptized, together with his son, Sven Forkbeard, at some point in the 960s, though this was a political expedient rather than a genuine religious epiphany. The nascent Danish state faced constant pressure from Otto I to its south, and conversion would remove one justification for conflict between the two states. It would also serve as a balance to the power of the nobility, who held a key role in pagan rites and were famously independent. Naturally, there was resistance to any form of conversion, and even Harold and Sven themselves seemed to be selective Christians. Nevertheless, the seeds had been sown for the eventual Christianization of Denmark. Another addition to this story is the development of a powerful Saxon state in the north of Germany under Bernard I. There are a number of Danish-Saxon wars fought in this period, and it's clear that easier raiding targets to the south were now blocked off. Harold's unification of Denmark created winners and losers, and those losers sought new pastures. Many still had trading and more than likely familial links to their kin in the Danelaw. They would have heard of the turmoil in England during the 970s and 980s, the sacking of monasteries, regicide, and regency all made England seem like an easy target. Their successes would provoke yet more raids until the highest members of Danish society were taking part, regardless of religious profession. Æthelred was crowned king soon after the regicide of his brother in 978. Being the only surviving son of Edgar, there was simply no other choice. The only other member of the House of Wessex was Athelwold, an ealdorman in southwest Wessex who was descended from Æthelred I, the older brother of Alfred the Great, thus far too distantly related to have been considered a viable candidate. He was between the ages of 9 and 12 at the time of his ascension, thus a regency was needed until he could rule on his own. This was naturally filled by those who had supported his candidacy following Edgar's death. Alfir, Æthelfrith and Æthelwold all took their natural place within this council. There was also the irrepressible Dunstan, who as Archbishop of Canterbury would be present. Regencies are often continuation governments, designed to maintain the status quo and to not rock the boat. Thus many of the charter witnesses from the reign of Edward are seen in the regency charters of Æthelred. Though the first two surviving charters are land grants to Alfir and Æthelwold, showing that the status quo applied more to some than others. The fact that we have the same witnesses in both the reigns of Edward and Æthelred indicate that Edward's faction had come to support the new king, though as we have seen, there was little alternative. It is also important to note that they attested below the Queen's faction, indicating their subordination. The reformist movement also continued apace, again showing that the disturbances from the reign of Edward were not primarily motivated by the reform movement, only exacerbated by it. It is also noteworthy that Bryfirth stops mentioning attacks upon monasteries, indicating that the new regency government was able to bring a degree of peace to the realm. Whilst they may have been able to maintain internal peace, the news of the disturbances in England had spread far and wide. It was in 980, 2 years into his reign, that Viking sails were once again seen on the horizon. Firstly, Southampton was plundered, with many of its inhabitants slain or taken into slavery. Later in the year, Thanet, once an island off the Kentish coast, was ravaged. Chester was also ravaged, though given its location, this may have been done by a separate warband. The following year saw attacks in Devonshire as well as Wales, whilst 982 saw attacks in Dorsetshire and London. This was serious, but it was not a crisis. The government continued operating as normal, and far more space is devoted in the charters to the death of notable churchmen and Otto's adventures in Italy. Following the raids in 982, it would be another 5 years until the Vikings returned. It is during this time that we begin to see Æthelred exert his political independence, aided by a succession of prominent deaths. The first to go was Alfheir of Mercia, who died in 983. He was succeeded by Alfric, who was believed to have been his brother-in-law, though he lasted only 2 years before being driven out. The earldom was then left vacant, and this would seem to be the beginning of a pattern where Æthelred would leave important earldoms vacant for extended periods of time. It would not be until the infamous Edric Striona that there would be another earl in Mercia. The following year saw the death of Athelwold, Bishop of Winchester. With these 2 deaths, Æthelred was able to strike out on his own course. He was able to sideline his mother, who was absent from any charters from the mid-980s, and it is in 985 that Æthelred marries his first wife, who post-conquest sources name as Ealgifu. It is claimed that she was the daughter of Thorid, ealdorman of Northumbria. This would seem to have been a sensible match. English kings struggled to exert their authority north of the Trent, thus a match with the most powerful nobleman in the area was a prudent move. This union was successful. Æthelred was to have 6 sons with Ealgifu: Athelstan, Ecgberht, Edmund, Edred, Eadwig, and Edgar. It is interesting to note that their names, with the exception of Ecgberht, mirror the succession order of the kings of England. He was also to have 3 daughters, Edith, Ealgifu, and Wulfhild. While successful in the bedroom, his other policies were less so. It is in this period that Æthelred picks up his much-mocked moniker, Unulaed. Like many kings emerging from a regency, he oversaw a direct break from the previous regime, in order to stamp his authority as king. He surrounded himself with a much younger cohort of advisors and counsellors. The number of lay recipients of land greatly increased, whilst religious houses often lost lands and privileges, often to the king's newer favourites. A notable example of this is Abingdon, a religious house founded by Æthelwold and a favourite of his mother. This house was stripped of previous grants, and the office of abbot was sold to the brother of Earl Alfric, a direct violation of the rules of St. Benedict. The new abbot then went on to abuse his position and further dilute the house's estates to the benefit of local reeves. Other monastic houses were also not safe. The situation was so bad that the monks of Glastonbury made a direct appeal to the Pope, with John XV writing to Alfric, urging him to restore the lands that he had taken from Glastonbury. Worse still befell Rochester, where in 986 the diocese was laid waste by Æthelred following an unsuccessful siege of the city. The cause of this commotion was that the bishop had expelled a soldier who Æthelred had granted lands to. These lands, though, were not the king's to grant. This new direction may have been another anti-monastic reaction, though again it is more likely that this was not motivated by a religious dispute, rather an attempt to break free from his former regents. This, though, was an ill-advised way to go about it. It was not just surrounding himself with new men, but an active rejection of the old order. It has been suggested by historians, such as Roche, that this may have been why Alfric was exiled from Mercia, though we will never know for sure. Regardless, this new course would have consequences. Herald of the Brim men, deliver this again. Say unto your people a more unpleasant report. Here stands with his troops a renowned earl, who wishes to defend his homeland. This country of Æthelred, my own lord, and his citizens and territory, the heathens shall perish in battle. The plight of the reformers did not go unnoticed by the Almighty. In 986, Following the ravaging of Rochester, a cattle plague swept the nation. The following year, Watchet was plundered, and worse came in 988, when Dorset was ravaged and Goda, a notable local thane, was killed. Then, in the summer of 991, disaster struck. A Viking army landed at Folkestone. They were unable to take the town, though plundered the local countryside. This army then moved northwards to Sandwich and Ipswich, extracting tribute as they went. This army was a substantial force. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle lists a fleet consisting of around 93 ships. If each ship could contain around 50 to 150 men, this would be a force of over 5,000, comparable in size to the estimates of the Great Theban Army of the previous century. To further illustrate the seriousness of the situation, this force was led by one of the great figures of the Viking Age, Olaf Tryggvason of Norway. It has also been suggested that Sven Forkbeard was also present, though it cannot be confirmed. Following their successes in East Anglia, the army then moved southwards and camped on Northey Island, just outside the town of Maldon. This island is connected to the mainland by a tidal causeway. The Vikings did not want battle, they wanted to plunder. There was an issue, however. The causeway was blocked by the army of Ealdorman Brynolf of Essex, who had called out his local levy once having heard of the Vikings' arrival. We cannot be sure, but it is implied that the English forces were outnumbered, though that they held the tactically superior position. The Viking forces attempted to buy themselves off, having little desire to fight, when all they desired was loot. Bryforth instead offered them a tribute of spears, and battle was joined. Given the narrowness of the causeway, the Viking forces were unable to make any headway, and were successfully contained on the island. It was then that a fateful decision was taken by Brynolf. In response to a Viking offer, he allowed for the Norsemen to cross the causeway. This decision has been explained in two ways, one charitable and one less so. The first is that Brynolf knew that once the tide came in, there was little he could have done to stop the Vikings simply sailing away and plundering another part of the coast. The power of the Vikings lay in their manoeuvrability, and even if he was defeated, he may have been able to deal them such a blow that they would be unable to continue their rampage. The less charitable option, and the view seemingly espoused by the famous poem, is that Brynolf was overcome by pride, and that he allowed them to cross under the belief that he would be victorious regardless. Once the Viking army was fully across, battle was rejoined. Initially went well for the English, who were able to hold the Vikings at bay. This was to change when Brynolf was slain. Confusion then reigned within the English lines, and it is alleged that someone fled on his horse, causing panic when they mistook him for Brynolf. With the exception of his household, who fought to the death, the English army soon routed, and the Vikings were left in command of the field of slaughter. The battle was a disaster for the English. The death of Brynolf not only robbed England of its most senior military leader, it also took away the leader of the so-called war party, those most willing to pursue a military response to the challenge of the Norsemen. It is notable that the defeat at Maldon saw the first payment of Danegeld under the reign of Æthelred. This was some £10,000 of silver and was arranged by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Tribute had been paid before by English kings to speed Vikings along in the past, and even Alfred the Great had paid off raiders, but this often had been from a position of strength, following victory. The tribute paid in 991 was paid from a position of weakness, following defeat, and would be the beginning of a troubling pattern. The defeat at Maldon was successful in one regard. The Norsemen were forced to abandon their raiding as they had suffered severe losses, despite their victory. It, however, did not stop them from returning in the following year. 992 saw renewed raiding. The king was determined to fight, and he ordered all ships of any account were to be gathered in London. An army was to be raised, and command was given to Ealdorman Alfric of Hampshire. Once the Vikings arrived, the fleet was to sail and trap them, a strategy that Harold Godwinson would attempt to use in 1066. Maldon, though, seems to have sapped the morale of the English, or at least that of its most prominent alderman, Alfric. He tipped the Northmen off about the plan, and they were able to escape and continue plundering. 993 saw Northumbria bear the brunt of Viking raids, with Bamberg being sacked. Again, cowardice is seen, with Florence of Worcester claiming that the local leaders took flight when they should have fought. Yet another raid came in 994, again led by Olaf and Sven Forkbeard, this time with 94 ships. An attempt was made on London, but they were unsuccessful. Despite this setback, the raid continued. The southeast was plundered, and at some point they were able to get hold of horses, greatly extending their reach. They soon made their way to Hampshire, where the slaughter continued. It was at this point where tribute was once again offered, this time £16,000 of silver. Olaf accepted, and was also baptised, with Æthelred as his sponsor. This was one of the few times that the Danegeld was successful. Olaf was encouraged to return to Norway, which he duly did. There, he was able to drive out Hakko Sigurdsson, the acting regent of Harald Bluetooth. He then began an aggressive campaign of Christianization. He was an active opponent to Danish ambitions in Norway until his death at the Battle of Maldon against Sven Forkbeard in the year 1000. Aside from this lone success, the English were completely unable to deal with the Viking threat in the 990s. A sign of the disruption caused is that there was not a single charter issued in the years 991 and 992. Why was this the case? Why could they not cope? The first point to note is that the Vikings had a massive strategic advantage in their mobility via their longships. The English coastline was incredibly vulnerable given its length, and it was simply not possible for the entire coastline to be garrisoned. England was also surrounded. The Norse raiders naturally had bases in Denmark and Norway to the east. To the north, there were the Viking outposts in the Scottish Isles. Adding to the bleak strategic picture was Normandy. Whilst nominally a Christian duchy under French suzerainty, it was an active supporter of the Norse raiders. They were of Norse stock, having settled the region in the 9th century. Their duke, Richard the Fearless, allowed for the Vikings to sell their plunder and slaves in Norman markets. They also allowed the Viking fleets to overwinter in Norman ports, extending the time that they were able to raid. It is claimed by some Norman chronicles that Æthelred even attacked the Normans, though this is doubtful, as the same chronicle claims that the force was driven off by Cotentin fisherwomen. The dispute was so bad that the Pope had to help negotiate a peace treaty between the two realms in 991, though once Richard died, his heir promptly reneged on the deal. Even when the English were able to fight the Norsemen, they were often defeated. It has been suggested that the Vikings were often more heavily armoured, with much of the English forces being composed of local Freyd levies, armed only with simple spears and shields, whilst the Norse raiders were equipped with mail halberds. This was in part again due to the mobility of the Norse, meaning that a local response was often the only way to raise forces in time to counter the raiders. They were also out-generalled. England had been at peace by this point for a generation. The reigns of Edgar and Edward saw no attacks by Vikings. Of the great magnates of the realm, only Brynolf seems to have had any military experience. The victors of the great battles of Athelstan would have been the grandfathers of the current military elite. There were no leaders with any experience of dealing with this kind of threat. In conjunction with this was a point raised by the chroniclers. Æthelred never led his army in person. Why was this? It has been suggested that he was simply too valuable to be risked. The first son of Æthelred, Athelstan Ætheling, was born sometime in the mid-980s. He only witnessed his first charter in 993. Were the king to have come to harm in battle, it would have resulted in another long regency, something that everybody was keen to avoid. This policy, though, came with a drawback. The 992 campaign saw 3 leaders appointed. With the king not present, decision-making would be split, a far from ideal situation. With the poor quality of English leadership, it was no wonder that the campaign dissolved into farce. When a golden opportunity to defeat a Viking army presented itself, it was squandered by infighting and betrayal, which could have been saved by the presence of the king. The final point is that there was simply no way for Æthelred to strike back. The English army simply lacked the logistical ability to attack Scandinavia. This is one of the critical advantages that Alfred had in his struggle. Once the Vikings had settled in England, they were vulnerable to attack. Æthelred's forebears had already conquered these lands. When there was a target that the English could hit, they did, as occurred when the English ravaged Strathclyde and Anglesey in the year 1000 in response to Welsh aggression. The one advantage that the English did seem to have was that the Vikings were unable to defeat settlements with strong defences. London was able to fight off a Viking attack in 994 thanks to its Roman walls, and it was not the only city in England to have such defences. It is safe to say that things were not going well for Æthelred, and naturally, this was attributed to God's wrath. For how was it that such deprivations could befall such a Christian people? Why was it then that the Lord's wrath was directed at the English? Simple. The king had overseen the despoilment of monastic houses, the ravaging of bishoprics, and had failed to see justice done to his own brother. England needed a new direction, though only time would tell what this would be. If you have made it this far, thank you very much for listening. Any feedback would be greatly appreciated. This is the first time I've ever done anything like this, so I am sure there are lots of things that can be improved upon. With this, my aim is to go all the way to the reign of Henry I, but we'll see how far I get. Again, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed it.